Emma Chen stared at her cracked phone screen, her heart sinking as she realized what she'd just done. The text meant for her best friend about her mother's emergency surgery had somehow been sent to a random number, one that belonged to Alexander Kane, CEO of Kane Industries, the most powerful tech company on the West Coast. Within hours, a private jet would be landing at the small regional airport near her struggling hometown. But Emma had no idea her life was about to change forever. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning had started like any other in Millfield, a forgotten town 2 hours outside Seattle, where the biggest employer had closed 3 years ago. Emma hurried down the cracked sidewalk, her worn sneakers splashing through puddles left by the previous night's rain. Her second-hand coat was too thin for the October chill, but she barely noticed the cold anymore. At 23, she'd learned to ignore a lot of things. The whispers about her family's financial troubles, the pitying looks from former classmates who'd managed to escape to college, the growing stack of medical bills on her kitchen table. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of Millfield Community Hospital, a modest building that looked more like an oversized clinic than a real medical center. The familiar smell of disinfectant and floor wax hit her as she approached the reception desk, where Mrs. Patterson, a kindly woman in her 60s, looked up with concern etched across her weathered face. "Emma, dear, how's your mother doing today?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the gentle cadence of someone who'd spent decades delivering both good news and heartbreak to families in crisis. "The doctors want to do the surgery tomorrow," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "They say her heart can't wait much longer." She didn't mention the other thing the doctors had said, that without the procedure, her mother had maybe 3 weeks left. Some truths were too heavy to speak aloud in the harsh fluorescent lighting of a hospital lobby. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened further. "And the insurance situation?" Emma's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They're calling it experimental. $30,000 up front." The number felt surreal, like play money in a game she'd never agreed to join. Her mother's teaching pension barely covered their monthly expenses, and Emma's job at the local diner brought in just enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. "Oh, honey," Mrs. Patterson murmured, reaching across the counter to squeeze Emma's hand. "Have you considered reaching out to some of the charitable organizations? Sometimes they can help with cases like this." Emma nodded, though she'd already spent countless hours on the phone with various foundations and aid groups. The answer was always the same. They were sorry, but their funds were committed to other cases. She was learning that being poor wasn't just about lacking money. It was about lacking the connections, the knowledge of how to navigate systems designed by and for people who'd never worried about choosing between groceries and electricity. After leaving the hospital, Emma walked the 12 blocks to Murphy's Diner, where she'd worked since high school. The late shift wasn't glamorous, but it allowed her to care for her mother during the day and brought in tips from the handful of truckers and night workers who still passed through Millfield. The diner itself was a relic from the 1960s, with cracked red vinyl booths and a jukebox that played the same 20 songs on endless repeat. "You're early," called out Janet, the day shift waitress, as she wiped down the counter with practiced efficiency. Janet was in her 40s, a single mother whose quick wit and kind heart had kept the diner running through various ownership changes and economic downturns. "Couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, tying her apron around her waist. "Figured I might as well make myself useful." She'd been having trouble sleeping for weeks, ever since the first doctor had used the word urgent in connection with her mother's condition. Every night brought the same cycle of worry, about money, about time, about the growing certainty that she was going to lose the only family she had left. The dinner rush was typical for a Tuesday night, which meant a handful of regulars and a few travelers looking for something that resembled home cooking. Emma moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and offering the kind of small-town friendliness that had become her trademark. But her mind kept drifting to the impossible math of her situation. During a lull between customers, she pulled out her phone and opened her text messages. Her best friend Sarah, who'd moved to Portland for college and never looked back, had been her constant source of support through the crisis. Emma's fingers moved quickly across the cracked screen as she typed out her daily update, the kind of message that had become their routine over the past month. "Hey, Sarah! Doctors confirmed they can do Mum's surgery tomorrow, but insurance won't. Cover it! Need 30K up front. I've called everyone, applied everywhere, don't know what else to do, starting to think maybe this is it. Can't watch her fade away, but can't save her either. Feel so helpless. Miss talking to you. Love you." She hit send without looking, her attention already shifting back to the customer waving for his check. It wasn't until 20 minutes later, when her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number, that she realized something was very wrong. "Hello?" she answered cautiously, stepping into the narrow hallway behind the kitchen where she could speak privately. "Is this Emma Chen?" The voice was deep, authoritative, with the kind of crisp pronunciation that suggested expensive education and even more expensive suits. "Yes, who's asking?" Emma's defensive instincts kicked in. Unknown callers usually meant debt collectors or telemarketers, neither of which she had time for tonight. "My name is Alexander Kane. I think you sent me a text message by mistake." Emma's blood ran cold as the reality hit her. She quickly scrolled through her recent messages and saw the horrifying truth. Her text to Sarah had somehow been sent to a contact labeled A. Kane instead. She vaguely remembered Sarah mentioning something about adding some work contact to her phone months ago, but she'd never paid attention to the details. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," Emma stammered, her face burning with embarrassment. "That was meant for my friend. I don't know how. I'm really sorry to bother you." "Don't apologize." Alexander's voice was softer now, almost gentle. "Your mother needs surgery." Emma hesitated, unsure why this stranger was asking personal questions. Yes, but that's not your problem. I'm really sorry for the mistake." "What kind of surgery?" Despite every instinct telling her to hang up, something in his tone made her answer. "Her heart, the valve is failing. They say it's urgent, but insurance won't cover the procedure they need to do." There was a long pause, and Emma could hear what sounded like papers rustling in the background. "Which hospital?" "Millfield Community, but sir, I really don't understand why." "I'm going to help you." The simple statement hit Emma like a physical blow. She slumped against the wall, phone pressed to her ear, trying to process what she'd just heard. "I'm sorry, what?" "I said I'm going to help. What's the exact amount you need?" Emma's hand trembled as she gripped the phone tighter. $30,000, but I can't possibly accept." "Consider it done. Give me the hospital's information and your mother's full name. I'll have my people contact them tonight." "Sir, Mr. Kane, I don't understand. Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Another pause, this one longer. When Alexander spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience with loss. "Because I know what it's like to feel helpless when someone you love is dying, and because $30,000 is nothing compared to having your mother alive." Emma felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't remember when she'd started crying. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll give me the information so we can save your mother's life." With shaking hands, Emma provided the details Alexander requested. He assured her that someone from his team would contact the hospital within the hour and that the surgery would be covered in full. As the call ended, Emma found herself staring at her phone in disbelief, wondering if she'd somehow hallucinated the entire conversation. But 20 minutes later, Mrs. Patterson called from the hospital with news that seemed impossible. An anonymous benefactor had contacted the billing department and arranged for full payment of her mother's surgery. The procedure was scheduled for 7 the next morning. Emma finished her shift in a daze, mechanically serving the last few customers, while her mind reeled from the evening's surreal turn of events. She kept checking her phone, half expecting another call revealing that it had all been some elaborate mistake or cruel joke, but no such call came. As she walked home through the quiet streets of Millfield, past the boarded-up storefronts and the streetlights that flickered more than they shone, Emma found herself thinking about the voice on the phone. Alexander Kane had spoken with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems with a phone call and a checkbook, but there had been something else in his tone, a recognition of pain that suggested his wealth hadn't insulated him from loss. She pulled out her phone and searched for his name, her eyes widening as the results populated. Alexander Kane, 32 years old, CEO of Kane Industries, estimated net worth in the billions. The photos showed a man with dark hair and serious eyes, often pictured at charity galas or business conferences. He looked exactly like what she'd imagined. Polished, successful, inhabiting a world so far removed from hers that they might as well have been living on different planets. Yet somehow, through a misdirected text message and what could only be described as an act of extraordinary kindness, their worlds had collided. As Emma reached her small house, where her mother was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, she realized that tomorrow would bring more than just a life-saving surgery. It would mark the beginning of something she couldn't yet name or understand, but that felt as significant as the beating of her mother's soon-to-be-repaired heart. The porch light cast long shadows across the front yard as Emma fumbled with her keys, her hands still shaking slightly from the magnitude of what had just transpired. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the oxygen concentrator in her mother's bedroom. Emma tiptoed down the hallway and peered through the slightly open door, watching the steady rise and fall of her mother's chest under the worn quilt they'd shared through countless winters. Tomorrow, if everything went according to plan, that fragile rhythm would be supported by a properly functioning heart valve. The thought filled Emma with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and persistent disbelief. She'd grown up believing that miracles were fairy tales designed to comfort children and desperate adults, but tonight had challenged every cynical lesson poverty had taught her. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem more vivid, more real. Emma had barely slept, alternating between checking on her mother and staring at her phone, still half convinced that the previous night's conversation had been an elaborate dream. But at 5:30 a.m., as she helped her mother into the car for the drive to the hospital, the reality of Alexander Kane's intervention became undeniable. The hospital parking lot was unusually busy for such an early hour, with several expensive cars that seemed wildly out of place in Millfield's modest landscape. Emma noticed a sleek black sedan with tinted windows parked near the emergency entrance, but thought nothing of it as she focused on getting her mother safely inside. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Martinez, the cardiac surgeon who'd been treating her mother, met them at the pre-op entrance with an expression Emma had never seen before, something between bewilderment and professional excitement. Mrs. Chen, Emma, I have to say, in 20 years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like this. What do you mean? Emma's mother, Linda Chen, asked weakly from her wheelchair. Despite her illness, she maintained the dignity and composure that had carried her through 30 years of teaching middle school mathematics. Your anonymous benefactor didn't just cover the surgery, Dr. Martinez explained, walking alongside them as they moved toward the preoperative area. They arranged for Dr. Rebecca Walsh to fly in from Johns Hopkins. She's one of the top cardiac surgeons in the country, specializes in exactly this type of valve replacement. Emma stopped walking, causing the small procession to halt in the middle of the hallway. I don't understand. Mr. Kane said he would cover the surgery, but he didn't mention bringing in another doctor. Mr. Kane. Dr. Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly. Alexander Kane, the tech billionaire. When Emma nodded, his expression shifted to something approaching awe. Well, that explains the private medical jet that landed at the regional airport this morning. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd thought Alexander's offer to pay for the surgery was already beyond generous, impossibly kind. But flying in a specialist surgeon, arranging for private medical transport, it spoke to a level of resource and influence that made her previous understanding of wealth seem laughably naive. There must be some mistake, Emma said quietly, though even as she spoke she knew there wasn't. Why would he do all this for a complete stranger? Before Dr. Martinez could respond, a woman in surgical scrubs approached them with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. She was perhaps 45, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back severely and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her surroundings. Mrs. Chen? The woman extended her hand to Emma's mother. I'm Dr. Rebecca Walsh. I understand you need a mitral valve replacement, and I'm here to make sure we do it right. Emma's mother shook the offered hand with as much strength as she could muster. Doctor, I don't know how to thank you for coming all this way. Thank Mr. Kane, Dr. Walsh replied with a slight smile. He can be quite persuasive when he wants. Something done properly. She turned to Emma. You must be the daughter. Your message last night certainly set things in motion. You spoke to him? Emma asked, still struggling to process the scope of Alexander's involvement. Briefly. He called my service around midnight, explained the situation, and asked if I'd be willing to take the case. When Alexander Kane calls personally and mentions that time is critical, you don't say no. Dr. Walsh's tone was matter-of-fact, but Emma caught a hint of curiosity in her expression. He seemed unusually invested in ensuring your mother receives the best possible care. As they continued toward the surgical prep area, Emma found herself replaying the previous night's phone conversation, searching for clues about Alexander's motivations. His voice had carried a pain that seemed disproportionate to their brief interaction, a recognition of loss that suggested personal experience with medical crises. But nothing in their conversation had prepared her for this level of intervention. The preoperative procedures passed in a blur of consent forms, medical history reviews, and final preparations. Dr. Walsh took time to explain the surgery in detail, her manner both professional and reassuring. She'd performed hundreds of similar procedures, she explained, and the fact that they were able to operate before Mrs. Chen's condition deteriorated further significantly improved the prognosis. Dr. Walsh, Emma said, as her mother was being prepared. For surgery, may I ask you something? Of course. In your conversation with Mr. Kane, did he say why he was doing all this? I mean, beyond just being generous. Dr. Walsh paused in her review of the surgical notes, studying Emma with the kind of attention usually reserved for complex medical puzzles. He didn't elaborate, but I've known Alexander professionally for several years. We've worked together on medical technology initiatives. This level of personal involvement is unusual for him, even given his philanthropic activities. Philanthropic activities? You don't know. Dr. Walsh seemed genuinely surprised. Kane Industries funds some of the most advanced medical research in the country. He's particularly focused on cardiac surgery innovations, surgical robotics, things like that. But this, she gestured broadly, flying me in personally, arranging private transport, handling everything himself rather than through his foundation. This is different. As Emma processed this information, a nurse approached to inform them that the surgery would begin in 30 minutes. Emma kissed her mother's forehead, whispered words of love and encouragement, and then found herself alone in the surgical waiting area, surrounded by the antiseptic quiet that seemed to amplify every worry and hope. She pulled out her phone and, almost without thinking, composed a text message. "Mr. Kane, I don't have adequate words to thank you for what you're doing for my mother. Dr. Walsh seems wonderful, and I can't believe you arranged for her to come here. I keep wondering why you're doing all this for strangers, but mostly I just want you to know that you're saving her life, and mine too. I'll never be able to repay this kindness." She stared at the message for several minutes before hitting send, then immediately regretted the decision. Alexander Kane was probably in back-to-back meetings, managing a billion-dollar company. The last thing he needed was emotional text messages from the random person whose misdirected message had somehow triggered this extraordinary chain of events. But her phone buzzed within minutes, displaying a response that made her heart skip. "Emma, no thanks necessary. How are you holding up? Surgery days are hard." The casual use of her first name, the personal tone, the immediate response, it all suggested a level of attention that went far beyond charitable obligation. Emma found herself staring at the message, trying to decode its meaning, when her phone rang. "Hello, I hope you don't mind that I called." Alexander's voice was gentle, tinged with concern. "I wanted to check on you before the surgery started." "You called me," Emma said, still processing the surreal nature of the situation. "You're actually calling to check on me. Is that so strange? Mr. Kane, you're a billionaire CEO. I work the night shift at a diner in a town most people couldn't find on a map. Yes, it's strange." Alexander's laugh was warm, genuine, lacking the polished artificiality Emma had expected from someone of his status. "Fair point, but strange doesn't necessarily mean wrong, does it?" Emma found herself smiling despite the stress of the morning. "I suppose not. Though I have to ask, why are you really doing all this? And please don't say it's just because you can afford to help. There's something else." The pause was long enough that Emma wondered if the call had been dropped. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that seemed to strip away years of corporate polish. "My father died when I was 15. Heart attack, sudden and massive. My mother spent everything we had trying experimental treatments, flying to specialists around the world, anything that might help. It didn't work, but I learned something important about how quickly everything can change and how helpless you can feel when the people you love are suffering." Emma felt tears welling up, though she couldn't quite identify whether they were from gratitude, sadness, or simple emotional overwhelm. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you. The point is, I remember what that helplessness feels like. When I got your text last night, I heard that same desperation I'd felt as a teenager. The difference is that now I have resources to actually do something about it. But you don't even know us. I know enough. I know you're working night shifts to support your mother while she's sick. I know you've exhausted every other option before reaching the point of desperation. I know you care enough to text your friend in the middle of a work shift because you're scared." Alexander's voice grew stronger, more certain. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Emma wiped away tears with her free, and acutely aware that she was having the most important conversation of her life while sitting in a hospital waiting room, surrounded by fluorescent lighting and the distant beeping of medical equipment. "Dr. Walsh mentioned that you're involved in medical research," she said, partly to change the subject and partly from genuine curiosity. "Among other things, yes, Kane Industries has significant investments in medical technology. We're working on next-generation surgical robotics, AI-assisted diagnosis systems, things that could revolutionize patient care. But all the technology in the world doesn't matter if people can't afford to access it. Is that why you do the philanthropic work?" "Partly. Though I have to admit, most of our charitable giving goes through proper foundations, with applications and review processes. What I'm doing for your mother is more—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Personal." Emma wanted to ask what made her situation personal for him, but before she could formulate the question, Dr. Martinez appeared in the waiting room doorway. "Emma, Dr. Walsh is about to begin the procedure. Everything looks good so far." "Mr. Kane, I have to go," Emma said quickly into the phone. "They're starting the surgery. I'll be thinking of you both. Call me when it's over? You want me to call you?" "Yes, I do. Promise me." "I promise." As Emma ended the call, she realized that Alexander Kane had become more than just the stranger who'd saved her mother's life. In the span of 12 hours, he'd become someone she genuinely wanted to talk to, someone whose voice brought comfort in the midst of her greatest fear. The thought was as terrifying as it was unexpected, opening possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. The surgery took 4 hours, during which Emma alternated between pacing the waiting room, calling in sick to the diner, and responding to concerned texts from the handful of friends and neighbors who knew about her mother's condition. She found herself checking her phone constantly, not for updates from the surgical team, but hoping for another message from Alexander. When Dr. Walsh finally emerged from the operating room, still in surgical scrubs, but with the relaxed posture of someone who'd just completed a successful procedure, Emma felt a weight lift from her chest that she'd been carrying for months. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "The surgery went perfectly," Dr. Walsh announced with a smile. "The new valve is functioning beautifully, and your mother's heart is already showing improved circulation. She'll need several weeks of recovery, but the prognosis is excellent." Emma collapsed into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by relief so intense it felt physical. "She's going to be okay. She's going to be fine. Better than fine, actually. Once she's fully recovered, she should have better cardiac function than she's had in years." As Dr. Walsh continued explaining the recovery process and follow-up care, Emma's mind drifted to the phone call she'd promised to make. Alexander Kane was waiting to hear whether his extraordinary intervention had succeeded, whether a misdirected text message had led to saving a life. She realized, with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, that calling him wouldn't just be reporting medical news. It would be continuing a conversation that had already changed everything she thought she knew about kindness, about possibilities, and about the unexpected ways that lives could intersect across seemingly impossible divides. 3 hours after the surgery ended, Emma sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor that now displayed numbers. Dr. Walsh had described as textbook perfect. Linda Chen was still sedated, but her color had already improved dramatically, and the labored breathing that had become frighteningly normal over the past months had been replaced by the deep, even respirations of genuine rest. Emma pulled out her phone, staring at Alexander's contact information for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. She'd promised to call when the surgery was over, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself paralyzed by an emotion she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more complex, a nervous anticipation that suggested this call would be about more than just medical updates. Before she could overthink it further, she pressed the call button. "Emma?" Alexander's voice came through immediately, as if he'd been waiting by his phone. "How did it go?" "She's perfect," Emma said, surprised by the thickness in her own voice. "Dr. Walsh said the surgery couldn't have gone better. Mum's heart is already functioning better than it has in years." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Emma wondered if the call had dropped. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. "I'm so relieved," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about you both all day." "You've been thinking about us?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. "Don't you have a company to run?" Alexander's laugh was soft, almost embarrassed. "I do, and my assistant spent the day wondering why I kept checking my phone during meetings. This isn't typical behavior for me." Emma felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite identify. "What is typical behavior for you? Work, mostly, meetings, strategic planning, reviewing quarterly projections. I'm usually very focused, very compartmentalized. I don't typically get personally involved in charitable cases." "Then why did you get involved in ours?" Another pause, and Emma could hear what sounded like footsteps, as if Alexander was pacing. "Honestly, I'm still trying to figure that out. Myself, when I got your text last night, something about it just affected me. Maybe it was the helplessness in your words, or the fact that you were texting a friend instead of posting on social media for sympathy. It felt genuine in a way." "That's rare." Emma looked at her sleeping mother, thinking about all the nights she'd lain awake worrying, all the phone calls to insurance companies and financial aid offices that had led nowhere. "It was genuine. I really didn't know what else to do. And now I'm sitting in a hospital room with my mother breathing normally for the first time in months, talking to a man I've never met who somehow arranged a miracle. I honestly don't know how to process any of this. Would it help if we met in person?" The question came out quickly, as if Alexander had been working up the courage to ask it. "I mean, I'd like to meet you properly, if you're comfortable with that." Emma's heart skipped in a way that had nothing to do with medical anxiety. "You want to meet me?" "Very much. I could drive up to Millfield, or if you'd prefer, once your mother is stable enough, you could visit Seattle. Whatever works better. And for your situation," the offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Emma wasn't sure she was ready to examine. "Why would you want to meet me? I mean, you've already done more than enough." "Because," Alexander said, his voice growing more confident, "in 32 years of life, I've never had a conversation that made me forget about quarterly earnings reports. I've never met anyone who could make me rearrange my entire day just to wait for a phone call. I'd like to understand why that is." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful that Alexander couldn't see her reaction. "That's very flattering. But you should know that I'm not exactly in your social circle. I mean, I work at a diner, Mr. Kane. I live in a house with vinyl siding and a yard full of dandelions." "Alexander," he corrected gently, "and I don't care about social circles. I care about the fact that you're working night shifts to support your sick mother, that you've never asked for charity or expected anyone to rescue you, and that somehow a misdirected text message led to the most meaningful conversation I've had in years." Emma was quiet for a long moment, watching her mother's chest rise and fall with healthy rhythm. Everything about this situation defied logic, challenged every assumption she'd made about how the world worked. Billionaire CEOs didn't develop personal interests in waitresses from forgotten towns. Fairy tale rescues didn't happen to people like her. "Emma, are you still there?" "I'm here. I'm just trying to figure out if this is really happening." "It's happening," Alexander said, his voice warm with something that might have been affection, "and I'd very much like to see where it leads, if you're willing." Before Emma could respond, her mother stirred in the hospital bed, eyes fluttering open for the first time since the surgery. Emma quickly stood, moving closer to the bed. "Mom, how are you feeling?" Linda Chen's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. "Better. Much better. The pain in my chest is gone." "Alexander, I need to go," Emma said into the phone. "My mother just woke up." "Of course, give her my best wishes for a full recovery. And Emma, yes? Think about what I said. I'll call you tomorrow to check on her progress, but I hope we can also talk about meeting in person." As Emma ended the call, her mother's eyes focused on her with surprising sharpness for someone just emerging from major surgery. "Who was that?" Linda asked weakly. Emma sat back down, taking her mother's hand gently. "That was Alexander Kane. He's the man who paid for your surgery and arranged for Dr. Walsh to come here." Linda's eyebrows rose as much as her current condition allowed. "The man who saved my life, yes. And he wants to meet you?" Emma felt herself blushing again. "Apparently?" Despite her weakness, Linda managed a small smile. "Emma, honey, in 60 years of life I've learned that some opportunities only come once. When someone shows you genuine kindness, especially someone with the resources to back up their words with action, you pay attention. Mom, he's a billionaire. I serve coffee and burgers for a living. And yet he's the one calling you, asking to meet you, rearranging his schedule to wait for news about my surgery." Linda's grip on Emma's hand tightened slightly. Money doesn't make someone call a stranger just to make sure they're holding up okay during surgery. That comes from character. Emma thought about Alexander's voice when he talked about his father's death, the vulnerability that had crept through his professional composure. She thought about his immediate response to her text, his insistence on bringing in the best surgeon available, his genuine concern for her emotional state during the surgery. "What are you saying, Mom?" "I'm saying that life just handed you something extraordinary, and you'd be foolish not to explore it. Whatever his reasons for helping us, whatever his interest in you might be, he's already proven himself to be a good man. That's rarer than money, Emma." As Emma sat in the quiet hospital room, watching her mother rest peacefully for the first time in months, she realized that everything in her life had changed in the span of 24 hours. Not just because of the successful surgery, but because of the unexpected connection that had formed with a man whose world seemed impossibly different from hers. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Tell your mother I'm glad she's recovering well. And Emma, I meant what I said about meeting. When you're ready, I'll be here. Alexander." Emma stared at the message, knowing that her response would determine the direction of whatever this was becoming. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that fairy tales might occasionally happen to ordinary people, and that sometimes the most profound changes began with the smallest mistakes. 2 weeks after the surgery, Emma's life had settled into a new routine that felt both familiar and completely foreign. Her mother's recovery was progressing exactly as Dr. Walsh had predicted. Better, even. Linda Chen was walking the hospital corridors twice a day. Her color had returned to normal, and the oxygen concentrator that had dominated their living room for months was now gathering dust in the basement. But the most dramatic change wasn't medical. It was the daily phone calls from Alexander Kane. What had started as check-ins about Linda's condition had evolved into conversations that stretched well beyond medical updates. Alexander called every evening at 7, and Emma found herself looking forward to these talks with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. They discussed everything from her mother's physical therapy progress to Alexander's frustrations with board meetings, from Emma's dreams of maybe someday finishing college to Alexander's surprisingly detailed knowledge of diner coffee quality across different regions. "You know," Alexander said during their 14th consecutive daily call, "for someone who claims to make terrible coffee, you seem to have very strong opinions about what constitutes good coffee." Emma laughed, settling more comfortably into the worn armchair beside her mother's bed. "That's because I drink a lot of coffee, and most of it is terrible. You develop standards out of self-preservation. I'll have to remember that when I visit Millfield. Speaking of which, have you given any more thought to my suggestion?" The question that had become a gentle constant in their conversations. Alexander had asked 3 times to visit, always carefully, always with an out if Emma felt uncomfortable. Each time she'd deflected with concerns about her mother's recovery, about the inappropriateness of the situation, about the simple fact that Millfield had nothing to offer someone accustomed to five-star everything. "Alexander," Emma said carefully, "what exactly do you think would happen if you came here? I mean, what are you expecting?" "Honestly, I'm not sure. I know I want to meet you in person. I know these conversations have become the best part of my day. Beyond that, I'm trying not to have expectations." Emma twisted the phone cord around her finger, a nervous habit left over from childhood. "What if we meet and you realize I'm just a small-town waitress who got lucky with a misdirected text? What if there's nothing special here?" Emma, Alexander's voice grew serious. "In 2 weeks of talking to you, I've learned more about genuine kindness, resilience, and grace under pressure than I learned in 4 years at Harvard Business School. I've watched you manage your mother's recovery, work full-time to support your family, and somehow still find time to worry about whether you're worth my attention. Trust me, there's something special there." Before Emma could respond, the hospital room door opened, and Dr. Martinez entered with Linda's discharge papers. Emma's mother had been scheduled to go home that afternoon, marking the official end of the crisis that had brought Alexander into their lives. "I have to go," Emma told. "Alexander, Mom's being discharged. That's wonderful news. Call me tonight?" "Of course." As Emma helped her mother gather the few personal items they'd brought to the hospital, Linda watched her daughter with the knowing expression of someone who'd spent decades reading teenage emotions. "He's going to ask to visit again, isn't he?" Linda said as they waited for the wheelchair that would take her to the hospital entrance. "Probably. And you're going to say yes this time." Emma paused in folding her mother's nightgown. "I don't know, Mom. This whole situation is so far outside anything I understand. What if he meets me and realizes he's made a mistake? What if I'm just some charity case he's gotten attached to?" Linda reached for her daughter's hand. "Emma, honey, billionaires don't make daily phone calls to their charity cases. They write checks and move on. This man has been calling you every night for 2 weeks, not to check on my recovery, but because he wants to talk to you. But we're so different. Our worlds are completely..." "Different doesn't mean incompatible," Linda interrupted gently. "Your father and I came from different backgrounds too. He was the college-educated son of professors, and I was a farmer's daughter who'd never been more than 50 miles from home. But we found common ground in the things that really mattered." Emma had heard stories about her parents' courtship before, but they'd always seemed like ancient history. Now, facing her own impossible situation, she found herself hungry for details. What made Dad want to be with someone so different from his world? Linda smiled, her color better than it had been in months. "He said I challenged every assumption he'd made about what was important in life. I showed him that intelligence came in different forms, that strength didn't always look like what he expected, and that love had nothing to do with matching resumes." The parallels were too obvious to ignore, and Emma felt a flutter of nervous excitement mixed with terror. "Alexander says I make him forget about quarterly reports." There you go. When was the last time you met a man who could forget about work long enough to have a real conversation? Emma thought about the guys she'd dated in high school and the few relationships she'd attempted since. Most had been put off by her devotion to her mother, by the financial constraints that made typical dating nearly impossible, by the simple fact that she had responsibilities that took precedence over romantic adventures. "Never," she admitted. "And when was the last time you talked to someone every day and looked forward to it instead of feeling obligated?" "Never," Emma repeated, understanding her mother's point. The wheelchair arrived, and as they made their way through the hospital corridors, Emma found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 weeks ago, her biggest worry had been finding $30,000 to save her mother's life. Now her mother was healthy, their financial crisis was over, and she was contemplating whether to invite a billionaire to visit their modest house in a town most people drove through without stopping. As they reached the hospital entrance, Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Hope the discharge goes smoothly. Looking forward to hearing about your mom's first day back home. Also, I have something to ask you during tonight's call. Something important." Emma stared at the message, her heart rate accelerating. Something important could mean anything, but given the trajectory of their conversations, she suspected she knew what he wanted to discuss. The question was whether she was brave enough to say yes to whatever he was planning to ask. "What's that? Smile about?" Linda asked, as a hospital volunteer helped her into Emma's aging Honda Civic. "Alexander has something important to ask me tonight. And you already know what it is, don't you?" Emma started the car, pulling away from the hospital that had been the center of their world for the past 2 weeks. "I think he's going to ask to visit. For real this time, not just suggesting it and backing off when I hesitate." "Good," Linda said firmly. "It's time you stopped hiding behind excuses and started living your life." As they drove through Millfield's familiar streets toward home, Emma realized that her mother was right. Fear had been her constant companion for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to take risks, to hope for something beyond mere survival. Alexander Kane represented the biggest risk she'd ever contemplated, but he also represented possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. Tonight, when he called, she was going to say yes. That evening, Emma paced around her small living room while her mother rested comfortably on the couch, no longer needing the oxygen concentrator that had dominated the space for so many months. The familiar surroundings felt different somehow, as if the past 3 weeks had changed, not just their circumstances, but her perception of what was possible within these modest walls. At exactly 7 o'clock, her phone rang. "How's your mom settling? In at home?" Alexander's voice carried its usual warmth, but Emma detected an underlying tension that matched her own nervous energy. "She's doing wonderfully. Dr. Martinez says her recovery is ahead of schedule. She's already talking about going back to substitute teaching next month." "That's incredible news. And how are you doing with everything?" Emma glanced at her mother, who was pretending to read a magazine while obviously listening to every word. "I'm good. Actually, I'm better than good. For the first time in months, I can sleep through the night without worrying about emergency room visits." "Emma, I have something I need to ask you, and I want you to know there's no pressure attached to this. If you say no, it doesn't change anything between us." Emma's pulse quickened. "Okay. I'd like to come to Millfield this weekend. Not for a few hours, but for the whole weekend. I want to meet your mother properly, see where you live, understand your world, and I want you to get to know me as more than just a voice on the phone." The directness of the request caught Emma off guard, even though she'd been expecting it. "Alexander, I need to be honest with you about something. Millfield isn't exactly a destination. We don't have fancy restaurants or luxury hotels. The nicest place to stay is a Holiday Inn Express off the highway, and the most upscale dining is the Applebee's next to the Walmart." Alexander's laugh was genuine, delighted. "Emma, I've stayed in 5-star hotels in every major city in the world, and most of them feel exactly the same. I've eaten at restaurants where a single meal costs more than most people make in a week, and I can barely remember what any of it tasted like. The idea of experiencing somewhere real, somewhere that matters to someone I care about, sounds infinitely more appealing." "Someone you care about?" Emma's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Yes," Alexander said simply. "I care about you, Emma, more than I probably should after knowing you for only 3 weeks, but there it is." Emma sat down heavily in her father's old recliner, the worn fabric familiar against her back. "I care about you too," she admitted quietly. "That's what scares me." "Why does it scare you?" "Because this feels too good to be true. You're successful, intelligent, kind, and you could have anyone you want. Why would you choose someone like me? Someone like you? Alexander's voice grew firm. You mean someone who works 2 jobs to support her family, someone who faces an impossible situation with dignity and grace, someone who never once complained during our conversations about how unfair life has been, but instead talked about feeling grateful for what she has. Emma felt tears threatening. Alexander, I'm not finished. You want to know why I'm choosing? Because in 3 weeks, you've shown me what it means to have priorities that matter. You've reminded me that intelligence and education aren't the same thing, that wealth and worth aren't equivalent, and that the most important conversations happen when someone cares enough to really listen. Linda Chen chose that moment to speak, up from the couch. Emma, honey, put the man out of his misery and say yes. Emma heard Alexander laugh through the phone. Is that your mother? Yes, and she's been eavesdropping shamelessly. Mrs. Chen, Alexander called out loudly enough for Linda to hear, would it be all right with you if I visited this weekend? Young man, Linda replied, raising her voice toward the phone. I've been waiting 2 weeks for my daughter to stop being scared of her own happiness. You're more than welcome in our home. Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the rightness of the moment. Okay, she said quietly into the phone. Okay? Yes, Alexander, come to Millfield. Come meet us properly. Stay at the Holiday Inn Express and eat at Murphy's Diner and let me show you what my life actually looks like. Emma, are you sure? I'm terrified, she admitted. But I'm also curious. I want to see if this connection we have over the phone translates to real life. I want to know if you're really as kind and genuine as you seem, or if I'm setting myself up for the biggest disappointment of my life. And if I turn out to be a disappointment? Emma looked at her mother, who was watching her with proud, encouraging eyes. Then at least I'll know I was brave enough to find out. I'll drive up Saturday morning, Alexander said, his voice carrying a happiness that made Emma's heart skip. And Emma, thank you for taking this chance. I promise I won't make you regret it. As Emma ended the call, she realized she'd just committed to the most frightening and potentially wonderful weekend of her life. In 3 days, the mysterious man who'd saved her mother's life would be sitting in her living room, seeing her. World without filters or pretense. You did the right thing, Linda said softly from the couch. How do you know? Because for the first time since your father died, I heard you sound excited about the future, instead of just worried about surviving it. Emma curled up in the recliner, phone still in her hand, and allowed herself to imagine what Saturday might bring. Whatever happened, she was done hiding behind fear. Alexander Kane was coming to Millfield, and she was ready to find out if fairy tales could happen to ordinary people after all. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of grey October sky that made Millfield look even more tired than usual. Emma had been awake since 5 a.m., alternating between cleaning her already spotless house and staring out the window for any sign of an expensive car that didn't belong in her neighborhood. She changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on dark jeans and a soft blue sweater that her mother had insisted brought out her eyes. At exactly 10 o'clock, a sleek black BMW pulled into her driveway, looking as out of place as she'd expected, but somehow less intimidating than she'd feared. Emma watched from behind the living room curtain as Alexander Kane stepped out of the car, and her breath caught in her throat. The photos she'd found online hadn't done him justice. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it during the drive. He wore jeans and a navy sweater that managed to look both casual and expensive, and when he turned toward the house, she could see the same intelligent eyes that had gazed out from countless business magazine covers. But what struck her most was how normal he looked. Not like a billionaire CEO, not like someone who commanded boardrooms and managed billion-dollar deals. He looked like a man who was nervous about meeting someone important to him. Emma opened the front door before he could knock, and they stood facing each other across the threshold for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Up close, Alexander was even more handsome than his pictures suggested, but there was something vulnerable in his expression that the cameras had never captured. "Hi," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth she'd grown to love over the phone, but softer now, more uncertain. "Hi yourself," Emma replied, stepping back to let him inside. "You found us okay?" "Your directions were perfect." Alexander paused in the small entryway, taking in the modest surroundings with obvious interest rather than judgment. "This is nice, Emma. It feels like a real home." Emma looked around her living room, trying to see it through his eyes. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable. Photos of family and friends covered every available surface, and her mother's collection of houseplants turned the space into something approaching a greenhouse. It was nothing like the minimalist luxury she'd seen in magazine features about his penthouse apartment. "Alexander?" Linda Chen's voice called from the kitchen. "Come in here so I can meet the man who saved my life." Emma led Alexander through the living room to the small kitchen, where her mother was sitting at their round wooden table, looking healthier and more vibrant than she had in months. Linda stood as they entered, extending her hand with the dignity that had carried her through 30 years of teaching. "Mrs. Chen," Alexander said, taking her hand gently, "it's an honor to finally meet you in person." "The honor is mine, young man. Please, sit down. I've made coffee, and Emma tells me you're very particular about coffee quality." Alexander shot Emma a look of amused surprise. "She's been sharing our conversations?" "Only the embarrassing parts," Emma said, settling into the chair across from him. "Like your theory that diner coffee is a reliable indicator of regional character." "It is a reliable indicator," Alexander protested, accepting the mug Linda offered him. "The quality of coffee in any establishment tells you everything about their attention to detail and respect for their customers." He took a sip of Linda's coffee, and his eyes widened slightly. "This is excellent. What brand do you use?" "It's not the brand," Linda said with a knowing smile. "It's that I actually clean the coffee maker and use the right ratio of grounds to water. Most places make it too weak because coffee is expensive, or too strong because they don't know what they're doing." "See?" Alexander looked at Emma triumphantly. "Your mother understands the coffee theory." Emma found herself laughing, surprised by how easily Alexander fit into their kitchen conversation. She'd worried that he would seem like an alien visitor, that the differences between their worlds would create awkward silences and stilted exchanges. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in everything around him, asking Linda about her teaching career, commenting on the view from their kitchen window, and somehow making their modest space feel less small simply by appreciating it. "Alexander," Linda said, after they'd been talking for nearly an hour, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what are your intentions with my daughter?" Emma felt heat flood her cheeks. "Mom!" "It's okay," Alexander said, his expression growing serious. "Mrs. Chen, I'll be honest with you. I don't entirely understand what's happening between Emma and me. I know that talking to her has become the most important part of my day. I know that I've never met anyone who challenges me to think differently about what matters in life. And I know that I want to explore this connection, if Emma is willing." Linda studied him with the sharp assessment of someone who'd spent decades evaluating the sincerity of teenagers making excuses for missing homework. "That's a diplomatic answer. You want a less diplomatic one?" Alexander met her gaze directly. I'm falling in love with your daughter, and it terrifies me because I've never felt anything like this before. I don't know if she feels the same way, and I don't know if someone from my world can build something real with someone from hers, but I'm here because I have to find out." The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Emma stared at Alexander, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. He'd just admitted to falling in love with her, sitting at her mother's kitchen table, drinking coffee from a mug that said "World's Best Teacher." "Emma?" Linda's voice was gentle. "Do you have anything to say to that?" Emma looked between her mother and Alexander, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea how deep the drop might be. "I think," she said slowly, "that this weekend is going to be very interesting." Alexander's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "Ask me Sunday night," Emma replied, but she was smiling too. And for the first time since this impossible situation had begun, she felt truly hopeful about what might come next. That afternoon, Emma took Alexander on what she jokingly called the grand tour of Millfield, which consisted of driving down Main Street at 15 miles per hour while pointing out the highlights of her hometown. The tour included the post office that doubled as the town's social hub, the elementary school, where her mother had taught for 2 decades, and the small park where Emma had spent countless afternoons as a child. "That's Murphy's Diner," Emma said, as they pulled into the gravel parking lot of the squat brick building with its faded neon sign. "My home away from home for the past 5 years." Alexander studied the building with the same attention he might give a quarterly financial report. "This is where you work? This is where I work. Fair warning, everyone inside is going to stare at us. Strangers in expensive cars don't exactly blend in around here." As they walked through the front door, Emma's prediction proved accurate. The handful of Saturday afternoon customers, mostly farmers and retirees nursing coffee and pie, looked up with undisguised curiosity. Janet, who was covering the day shift, raised an eyebrow when she spotted Emma with an unfamiliar man in obviously expensive clothes. "Well, well," Janet said with a grin, "look what the cat dragged in. Emma Chen, you didn't tell me you had a boyfriend." "Janet, this is Alexander." "Alexander, Janet basically runs this place and has strong opinions about everything." Alexander extended his hand with genuine warmth. "It's nice to meet you, Janet. Emma's told me a lot about you." "Has she now?" Janet shook his hand while giving him the kind of thorough evaluation usually reserved for potential threats. "And what brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" "Emma does," Alexander replied simply. And Emma felt her heart skip at the honesty in his voice. Janet's expression softened noticeably. "Good answer. You two want some coffee? Fair warning, it's not fancy, but it's strong." They settled into a corner booth. The red vinyl cracked but clean, and Alexander looked around with obvious fascination. "How long have you been working here?" "Since I was 18. Started part-time during high school and just never left." Emma traced patterns on the formica table with her finger. "It's not exactly a career path, but it pays the bills, and Janet's been good to me about working around Mom's medical appointments." "There's nothing wrong with honest work," Alexander said firmly. "I spent summers washing dishes at a restaurant when I was in college. My father thought it would teach me character." "Did it?" "It taught me to respect people who work with their hands and that there's dignity in any job done well." Alexander's voice grew thoughtful. "It also taught me that the most interesting conversations often happen in kitchens and break rooms, not boardrooms." Janet appeared with 2 steaming mugs and a slice of apple pie she set in front of Alexander without being asked. "On the house," she said. "Emma's favorite, and if you're important to her, you should try it." Alexander took a bite of the pie, and his expression shifted to one of genuine surprise. "This is incredible. Did you make this?" "Every morning at 5 a.m., Janet replied with obvious pride. Emma's been trying to get the recipe out of me for years." "Because you refuse to write anything down," Emma protested. "You just eyeball everything. And somehow it turns out perfect every time. Cooking isn't about measurements, honey. It's about feeling." Janet turned to Alexander. "You cook? I reheat takeout and make coffee. That's about the extent of my culinary skills." "Well, that's a shame. A man should know his way around a kitchen." "Emma, here's a good cook when she puts her mind to it." Emma felt herself blushing. "Janet." "What?" "It's true. Remember when you made that lasagna for the church potluck? Gone in 10 minutes. Alexander looked at Emma with interest. "You cook?" "I make simple stuff. Nothing fancy." Emma took a sip of her coffee to avoid meeting his eyes. "When money's tight, you learn to be creative with ingredients. I'd love to try your cooking sometime," Alexander said, and something in his tone made Emma look up. He wasn't just being polite. He seemed genuinely interested in this mundane aspect of her life. They spent another hour in the diner, with various locals stopping by their table to say hello to Emma and satisfy their curiosity about her mysterious companion. Alexander handled each introduction with grace, asking thoughtful questions about farming, local history, and small-town life. By the time they left, Emma could tell that he'd won over everyone he'd met. "That was nice," Alexander said, as they walked back to his car. "I can see why you've stayed here, even though it's nothing like your world." Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her. "Emma, my world is glass towers and conference rooms and people who smile to your face while planning to stab you. In the back, your world is Janet making pie at 5 in the morning and neighbors who stop by to check on your mother when she's sick. Which one sounds more appealing to you?" Emma studied his face, looking for signs of condescension or pity, but found only sincerity. "You really mean that?" "I really do. I've spent most of my adult life surrounded by people who want something from me. Money, connections, favors. Everyone here just wanted to make sure you were happy." As they drove back toward her house, Emma found herself seeing Millfield through Alexander's eyes. The modest homes with their carefully tended gardens, the wide streets where children could ride bikes safely, the sense of community that came from everyone knowing everyone else's business. It might not be glamorous, but it was real in a way that apparently appealed to someone who'd spent years navigating the artificial world of corporate success. "Emma," Alexander said as they pulled into her driveway, "thank you for sharing this with me. I know it wasn't easy to let me into your world." "It's not over yet," Emma replied. "You still have to survive dinner with my mother and whatever interrogation she's planning." Alexander's smile was confident but warm. "I'm looking forward to it." That evening, Emma Chen proved that her recovery had restored not just her physical health, but also her legendary cooking skills. The small dining room filled with the aromas of her famous pot roast, homemade bread, and the green bean casserole that had been requested at every church potluck for the past decade. Emma watched nervously as Alexander took his first bite, wondering if someone accustomed to 5-star cuisine would appreciate her mother's comfort food approach. "Mrs. Chen," Alexander said after a moment of thoughtful chewing, "this is extraordinary. I haven't had a home-cooked meal this good since my grandmother died when I was 12. Linda beamed with the satisfaction of someone whose cooking had been properly appreciated. "Your grandmother cooked for you." Every Sunday dinner, until I was in middle school, she had this theory that food made with love tasted different from food made just to fill stomachs. Alexander's voice carried a wistfulness that Emma hadn't heard before. "She used to say that recipes were just suggestions, but caring about the people you're feeding was the real secret ingredient." "Smart woman," Linda said approvingly. "What happened to Sunday dinners after she passed?" Alexander's expression grew more guarded. "My father wasn't much of a cook, and we could afford to eat out whenever we wanted. It was more convenient than learning to manage a kitchen." Emma sensed there was more to the story, something about family dynamics and loss that Alexander wasn't quite ready to share. But Linda, with the intuition of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of teenage explanations, seemed to understand that the conversation had touched on something painful. "Well," Linda said gently, "you're welcome at our dinner table anytime you'd like a home-cooked meal." "I'd like that very much," Alexander replied, and Emma could hear genuine gratitude in his voice. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Linda settled into her favorite armchair and Emma curled up on one end of the couch. Alexander took the other end, careful to maintain a respectful distance, but close enough that Emma could feel the warmth of his presence. "Alexander," Linda said, in the tone that had preceded many important conversations over the years, "I want to thank you again for what you did for our family. Not just the money, though that was obviously crucial, but the way you've treated Emma throughout this whole situation. Mrs. Chen, I should be thanking you for raising such a remarkable daughter." "She is remarkable," Linda agreed, ignoring Emma's embarrassed protest. "But I'm curious about something. You could have simply paid for the surgery and walked away. Instead, you spent 3 weeks getting to know us. Why?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "When I was 15 and my father died, people kept telling me that everything happens for a reason. I thought that was the cruelest thing anyone could say, that there was some cosmic purpose behind losing the most important person in my life." Emma felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. "But getting Emma's text that night," Alexander continued, "meeting both of you, seeing how you've handled everything with such grace and strength, maybe there are some things that happen for reasons we can't see at the time." "You think you were meant to get that misdirected text?" Emma asked softly. Alexander turned to look at her, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "I think I was meant to meet you. I don't know why or what it means for the future, but yes, I believe that." Linda watched this exchange with the expression of someone who was seeing exactly what she'd hoped to see. "Emma, honey, would you mind making some tea? I think Alexander and I need to have a conversation." Emma recognized the tone and knew better than to argue. "Mom, please don't embarrass me." "I'll try to restrain myself," Linda said with a smile. That promised nothing of the sort. In the kitchen, Emma busied herself with the tea preparations while straining to hear the low voices from the living room. She couldn't make out specific words, but she could tell that her mother was asking serious questions, and Alexander was answering them with equal seriousness. When she returned with the tea tray, both Alexander and her mother looked satisfied with whatever had transpired in her absence. "What did I miss?" Emma asked, settling back onto the couch. "Your mother was making sure I understand how lucky I am to have met you," Alexander said with a smile that seemed both amused and moved. "And I was making sure he understands that if he hurts you, I may be 60 years old and recently post-surgical, but I still know how to make someone's life very difficult," Linda added cheerfully. "Mom, what? It's a reasonable conversation to have." Linda accepted her teacup with the dignity of someone who'd just delivered a perfectly rational threat. "Besides, Alexander assured me that hurting you is the last thing he'd ever want to do." Emma looked between her mother and Alexander, feeling like she'd missed several important plot points. "And what did you tell him about me?" "That you're stubborn, loyal to a fault, and that you've been taking care of everyone else for so long that you've forgotten how to let someone take care of you," Linda said matter-of-factly. "That's not true," Emma protested. "Honey, when was the last time you did something just because it would make you happy, not because it was responsible or necessary or good for someone else?" Emma opened her mouth to argue, then closed it as she realized she couldn't think of a single example. Alexander was watching her with an expression of understanding that was both comforting and unsettling. "That's what I thought," Linda said. gently. "Alexander, this daughter of mine has been the adult in this family since she was 16 years old. She's earned the right to be selfish occasionally." "I'll keep that in mind," Alexander said, his gaze still fixed on Emma's face. As the evening wound down, Emma walked Alexander to his car, the October air crisp enough to make her wrap her arms around herself. They stood beside his BMW, neither quite ready for the day to end. "Your mother is incredible," Alexander said. "I can see where you get your strength." "She likes you," Emma replied. "That's not always a given. She's protective." "She should be." "You're worth protecting." Alexander stepped closer, close enough that Emma could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Emma, I know this situation is complicated and probably overwhelming, but I want you to know that whatever this is between us, it's real for me." Emma felt her breath catch. "It's real for me too. That's what scares me." "Why does it scare you?" "Because I don't know how to be with someone like you. I don't know the rules, I don't understand your world, and I'm terrified of making a fool of myself." Alexander reached out and gently touched her face. "There are no rules, Emma. There's just you and me, trying to figure out if we can build something together. And for what it's worth, you could never make a fool of yourself. You're the most genuine person I've ever met." As Alexander drove away, Emma stood in her driveway watching his taillights disappear into the darkness, knowing that tomorrow would bring decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that made even Millfield's worn edges seem charming. Emma had slept fitfully, her mind replaying every moment of the previous day, every word Alexander had spoken, every look that had passed between them. She was standing at her kitchen window, nursing her second cup of coffee and watching leaves drift down from the old maple tree, when her phone rang. "Good morning." Alexander's voice was warm, already familiar enough to make her heart skip. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all. I've been up for a while." Emma glanced at the clock. It was barely 8 a.m. "Did you sleep well at the Holiday Inn Express?" "Better than I expected, actually, though I have to admit, I kept thinking about yesterday, about meeting your mother, seeing where you live, understanding your life better." Alexander paused. "Emma, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you're going to react." Emma's stomach tightened with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" "I don't want to leave today." The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. "You don't want to leave?" "I know that sounds crazy. I know I have meetings tomorrow, board responsibilities, a company to run. But sitting in that hotel room last night, all I could think about was how wrong it felt to be planning my departure from the first place that's felt like home in years." Emma sank into her kitchen chair, phone pressed to her ear. "Alexander, you can't just decide not to leave. Your whole life is in Seattle." "Is it, though? My whole business is in Seattle, certainly. My apartment, my routine, my obligations. But my life." Alexander's voice grew more certain as he spoke. "Yesterday was the first time in years that I felt like I was actually living instead of just managing." Before Emma could respond, she heard her mother's voice from the living room. "Emma, honey, is that Alexander? Tell him to come over for breakfast. I'm making pancakes." "Did you hear that?" Emma asked into the phone. "I heard it, and it sounds perfect. But Emma, before I come over, I need you to understand what I'm really saying. I'm not talking about extending my visit by a few hours. I'm talking about making changes, real changes." Emma's heart was beating so fast she worried it might be audible through the phone. "What kind of changes?" "The kind where I figure out how to spend more time in Millfield. The kind where I stop pretending that conference calls and quarterly reports are more important than this conversation. The kind where I find out if a billionaire CEO can build a real life with a diner waitress who makes him want to be a better person." Emma was quiet for so long that Alexander finally asked if she was still there. "I'm here," she said softly. I'm just trying to process what you're telling me. I'm telling you that I'm falling in love with you, Emma Chen. Not with some idealized version of you, not with the idea of you, but with the real you. The woman who works night shifts to support her family, who challenges insurance companies and fights for what's right, who makes coffee taste better just by being in the room when I drink it. Tears were streaming down Emma's face, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when she'd started crying. "Alexander, you don't have to say anything right now. Just let me come make pancakes with your mother and spend one more day pretending that geography and bank account balances don't matter." 20 minutes later, Alexander knocked on their front door carrying a bouquet of flowers that he'd somehow managed to find in Millfield on a Sunday morning. Emma opened the door to find him holding autumn mum's and baby's breath, looking nervous and hopeful in equal measure. "Where did you get flowers?" Emma asked, accepting the bouquet with surprise. "The gas station by the highway had a surprisingly good selection," Alexander admitted, with a self-deprecating smile. "I wanted to bring something, and flowers seemed like the safest choice." In the kitchen, Linda Chen was indeed making pancakes, the griddle already hot and a bowl of batter waiting on the counter. She looked up as Alexander entered, taking in his slightly rumpled appearance and obvious emotional state, with the sharp perception of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "You look like a man who's made a decision," Linda observed, flipping. "A pancake with practiced ease." "I think I have," Alexander replied, accepting the cup of coffee Emma offered him. "Though I'm not entirely sure it's a rational decision." "The best decisions rarely are," Linda said. "Rational decisions are safe. Predictable, boring. Love decisions are terrifying and wonderful, and usually involve jumping off cliffs without knowing if there's water at the bottom." Emma nearly choked on her coffee. "Mom, nobody said anything about love." "Honey, he drove 2 hours to bring you gas station flowers and talk about rearranging his entire life. If that's not love, it's a very convincing imitation." Alexander looked directly at Emma, his expression serious but tender. "Your mother's not wrong. I know it's too soon to say it. I know the timing is terrible. I know we've only known each other for 3 weeks. But I'm in love with you, Emma. Completely, irrationally, permanently in love with you." The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle sizzle of pancakes on the griddle. Emma stared at Alexander, her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that her response to this moment would determine the direction of both their lives. "I'm in love with you too," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "And it terrifies me because I don't know how this works. I don't know how we make this real." Alexander's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "We figure it out together. We take it one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one pancake breakfast at a time." Linda Chen quietly placed a stack of golden pancakes on the table, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. "Well," she said softly, "I'd say this calls for the good syrup." As they sat around the small kitchen table sharing breakfast and planning an impossible future, Emma realized that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the simplest moments: a misdirected text, a stranger's kindness, and the courage to believe that fairy tales could happen to ordinary people in small towns where gas station flowers were romantic and love could bloom over pancakes made with a mother's blessing. 6 months later, Emma stood in the brand-new community centre that had risen from the empty lot next to Murphy's Diner, watching Alexander explain the features of the state-of-the-art medical clinic to a group of amazed Millfield residents. The building bore a simple bronze plaque by the entrance, the Linda Chen Community Health Centre, where everyone deserves quality care. "The telemedicine setup will connect you directly to specialists at Seattle General," Alexander was saying, to Mrs. Patterson, who had driven over from the hospital to see the new facility. No more 2-hour drives for routine consultations or follow-up appointments, Emma smiled as she watched him field questions about equipment, staffing, and operating hours with the same intensity he'd once reserved for board meetings. Over the past 6 months, Alexander had gradually restructured his role at Kane Industries, delegating more operational responsibilities to his executive team while he focused on what he called meaningful impact projects. The Millfield Clinic was his first and most personal venture into healthcare accessibility. The best part, Emma heard him tell Dr. Martinez, who'd made the drive from the regional hospital, is that everything is covered by the center's endowment. No insurance requirements, no payment plans, no one turned away for inability to pay. Linda. Chen approached Emma, moving with the confident stride of someone whose heart was working perfectly. He's in his element, isn't he? He really is. You should see him in the planning meetings. He gets this look in his eyes like he's solving the most important puzzle in the world. Because for him, he is. Linda squeezed her daughter's arm gently. Emma, I hope you realize what you two have accomplished here. This isn't just about the clinic. Emma looked around the bustling room, where neighbors who'd never had reliable access to quality healthcare were touring examination rooms equipped with the latest diagnostic technology. Janet from the diner was deep in conversation with the new nurse practitioner about her arthritis treatment options. Mr. Henderson, who'd been driving to Seattle for his diabetes management, was beaming as he learned about the clinic's chronic disease programs. What do you mean? Emma asked. You changed him, and he changed our entire community. But more than that, you both proved that love doesn't have to make sense on paper to work in real life. Alexander appeared at Emma's side, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection that had developed over months of shared dinners, long phone calls, and weekend visits that had gradually extended until he was spending more time in Millfield than Seattle. How do you think it's going? He asked, nodding toward the crowd of residents exploring their new medical facility. I think you're about to become the most popular person in town, Emma replied. Mrs. Rodriguez has been telling everyone who'll listen that you're the answer to her prayers. We're the answer, Alexander corrected gently. This was your idea, remember. I just had the resources to make it happen. Emma thought back to the conversation 3 months earlier when she'd mentioned how many people in Millfield delayed medical care because of cost or travel barriers. Alexander had listened with the focused attention he brought to everything she said, then spent the next week researching rural healthcare access before announcing his intention to fund a community clinic. Dr. Walsh, Alexander called out as the cardiac surgeon entered the building, looking around with obvious approval. Dr. Walsh approached them with the brisk efficiency Emma remembered from her mother's surgery. This is impressive, Alexander. The equipment here rivals what we have at Johns Hopkins. That was the point, Alexander replied. Geography shouldn't determine the quality of healthcare someone receives. Your mother must be proud, Dr. Walsh said to Emma. Speaking of which, how is she doing? She's amazing. Back to substitute teaching, volunteering at the elementary school, and threatening to take up ballroom dancing. Excellent. And how are you adjusting to your new role? Emma glanced at Alexander, still amazed by the turn her life had taken. 2 months earlier, he'd asked her to become the clinic's community outreach coordinator, a position that combined her natural ability to connect with people with formal training in healthcare administration that Alexander had arranged for her to complete online. It's been incredible, Emma said honestly. I never imagined I'd be working in healthcare, but it feels right, like I'm finally doing something that matters. Everything you've ever done has mattered, Alexander said quietly. You just finally have the platform to help more people. As the evening wound down and the last of the visitors left the clinic, Emma and Alexander found themselves alone in the main reception area. The space was quiet now, but Emma could envision it bustling with patients, families, and staff members. dedicated to serving their community. Are you happy? Alexander asked, pulling her close in the empty lobby. Emma thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, her biggest aspiration had been keeping her mother alive and making it through each day without falling further behind on bills. Now she was engaged to a man who challenged her to dream bigger while loving her exactly as she was, working in a job that fulfilled her in ways she'd never expected, and living in a community that was thriving thanks to investments in education, healthcare, and economic development. "I'm happy," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. "But more than that, I'm grateful. Grateful for misdirected text messages, grateful for second chances, grateful for you." "Grateful for you too," Alexander murmured against her lips. "For teaching me that the best investments aren't measured in dollars and that the most important acquisitions can't be bought." As they locked up the clinic and walked hand in hand toward Alexander's car, he'd traded the BMW for a more practical SUV, better suited to Millfield's rural roads. Emma reflected on how dramatically her life had changed while somehow remaining fundamentally the same. She still lived in the same house, still helped her mother with daily tasks, still knew every regular at Murphy's diner. But now those familiar routines were enhanced by a love she'd never thought possible, and work that felt like a calling rather than just a necessity. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked as they drove through the quiet streets of Millfield. "I was thinking about fairy tales," Emma admitted. "How they always end with happily ever after, but they never show you what that actually looks like day to day." "And what does it look like?" Emma smiled, watching the familiar landmarks of her hometown pass by the window. "It looks like pancake breakfasts and community clinics. It looks like finding someone who loves your world enough to become part of it, and loving someone enough to let them change it for the better." "That sounds perfect to me," Alexander said, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. As they pulled into Emma's driveway, where the porch light was on, and Linda was waiting with leftover pot roast and stories about her day, Emma realized that happiness wasn't about dramatic gestures or fairy tale endings. It was about finding someone who made ordinary moments extraordinary, and building a life together, one misdirected text message, one act of kindness, one shared dream at a time. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.